Welcome to the UE Open Campus, St. Lucia. We are pleased to be partnering with our colleagues in the Faculty of Social Sciences at the St. Augustine campus and the Magna Carta 800th Anniversary Committee to bring you this distinguished lecture. I am particularly elated that this audience this morning is one mainly made up of young people, students. The UE Open Campus has an outreach mandate, which means that we facilitate a number of activities designed for public education. However, our public lectures are usually held on evenings, when most of you are likely completing homework assignments and doing your evening studies. Therefore, we deliberately selected this time of day for a change to accommodate you. Of course, we came under fire from other members of the public who said, why is the lecture being held at 10 o'clock and we can't attend? But we insisted that this was an opportunity for the young people, many of whom have probably never even heard of the Magna Carta. So I want to say also a special welcome, very special welcome to our students from the South, from Vieux Fort Campus B. And you don't often get an opportunity to be in the North during the weekdays. So welcome, and I hope you had a comfortable journey. And I hope you have a safe journey back down South. I assume that most of you have done some sort of preliminary reading. Your teachers would have mentioned the background to the Magna Carta and so on. And you're probably wondering, what does this ancient document have to do with you? This was an agreement signed in the year 1215. Can you even envisage or imagine that year? Or how long ago this could have been? 1215. And it was originally designed to protect the interests, and in particular, the pockets of a group of privileged Englishmen. What does that have to do with you, you ask? The Magna Carta is considered to be a foundation document on which modern constitutions like those of Great Britain and the USA have been built. However, its significance to modern society has been hotly debated. On one hand, it is held up as an enduring symbol of liberty and human rights, and on the other hand, it has been severely parodied as a hypocritical document, since it was promoting those rights for some and not for all. I'm sure that if you did your homework and read up on the Magna Carta, there are many questions going through your head. Does this document bear any pertinence at all in the 21st century? Should it be relegated to the annals of history and forgotten? How does it relate to us, descendants of an enslaved people? What are the implications for the commemoration of this Magna Carta for our young developing country with relatively recent independent status? The import of having this lecture and discussion on the eve of our independence celebrations should not be lost on us. And Dr. Ghani, we celebrate independence next week, yes, on the 22nd. Those involved in post-colonial studies argue that we are not truly post-colonial, but are still very much in the process of decolonization. How has the Magna Carta influenced this process? The Magna Carta addresses the issue of personal liberties. We often discuss these liberties in a context which does not take into consideration the broader implications of exercising such rights. I believe the topic of today's lecture will allow for the elucidation and discussion of those implications. I'm hoping that it does. Knowing our guest speaker as I do, I am confident that she will not shy away from addressing those questions and the many others that I expect you to pose to her later. I encourage you to take notes, ask as many questions as you desire following the lecture, put our guest speaker on the spot, And, you know, she's going to welcome it, and she's going to be able to react to that in a very animated manner, from what I know of her. So at this point, I would like to introduce Dr. Ghani and invite him to give you a little background on this whole anniversary commemoration activity and exercise, following which he will introduce our guest speaker.
Let me first of all begin by saying that the reason why we're here is that on the 15th of June this year, the Magna Carta will be 800 years old. And in the United Kingdom, a Magna Carta 800th Anniversary Committee was formed some time ago, and it is headed by a gentleman by the name of Sir Robert Worcester. He is more or less the driving force behind a lot of these Magna Carta activities. And the Magna Carta 800th Anniversary Committee put out a call for research grant applications last year. My unit at St. Augustine, we applied for one of those research grants to be able to have a number of academic exercises, lectures, seminars, discussions. The proposal that I put in envisaged doing this across the Commonwealth Caribbean as far as the budget that had been put forward for the research grant would permit. Basically, the philosophy that was adopted in the application was to have a number of lectures and seminars across the region. In my own mind, the University of the West Indies Open Campus was the ideal vehicle through which this could be delivered, notwithstanding the fact my own past working relationships with many of the individuals in the University of the West Indies Open Campus sites when I did serve as Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences until my term came to an end in 2012. The Open Campus seemed like a natural place to do this, so that 30th of August was the deadline for applications. The application went in. 1st of October, we were informed that the research grant application had been successful. As a consequence of that, we had a launch on the 18th of October in Trinidad, and the chairman of the Magna Carta 800th Anniversary Committee did come to Trinidad to launch this series of lectures and seminars. So the first one was in Trinidad for the launch. Subsequently, we had a hiatus going into the end of the year, over Christmas into the new year, and then we started on the 9th of January in Dominica. So we had one in Dominica on the 9th. On the 17th of January, we had one in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Then on the 29th of January, we had one in Belize. Then on the 2nd of February, we had one in Montego Bay at the University of the West Indies Western Jamaica campus. Then on the 4th of February, we had one at the Mona campus, in which the Faculty of Law at the Mona campus was our collaborator. And today we are here. We have next week, Friday, we are at the Cave Hill campus at UE and at Cave Hill in Barbados. And then on the 20th of March, we are in St. Kitts Nevis. The last one is going to be held in the Cayman Islands, which is the one British dependent territory that had been included in the research grant application. And that is on a date to be fixed in March. That more or less is the scope of what we're doing. We've had different approaches. One model has been to have an evening lecture with a featured speaker, and you invite a number of persons and so on from the general public. The other model that has been used is to have a morning lecture which could involve persons in tertiary level institutions, sixth form, CAPE students, as the case may be. And that's a model that has been used. So we've mixed it up a bit around the region, depending on what is convenient and what is strategic and what is desirable. And a mix of those factors have led us to choose one model or another, as the case might be. So that is more or less the picture that can be painted. At the end of the process, there will be an academic publication that will be published. All of these lectures are going to be collated and edited into an 800th anniversary publication that's going to come out of the Commonwealth Caribbean in respect of the Magna Carta. And so far, there are different perspectives being expressed, which is good. So today, we get out of the realm of the law and lawyers, and we move into the social sciences. So that our speaker today is someone who is not in the field of law, but rather is eminently qualified in the social sciences and in history. So that we're very happy this morning to be able to have Her Excellency Dr. June Soomer to give this lecture. And I'm very grateful to Dr. Simon for assisting in making these arrangements and for the contacts, because this is the essence of the collaboration, and this is indeed very very pleasing in terms of the way we can move forward with this particular project. Our featured speaker this morning, Dr. Soomer, received her PhD in history from the University of the West Indies in 1994. Since then, she has lectured at the University of the West Indies, the University of North Carolina in Wilmington, the University of North Carolina Central, and was a visiting lecturer at the University of San Francisco. Dr. Soomer served at the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank from 1996 to 2006 in the area of human resource development and strategic planning. During those years, she furthered her education in these areas, as well as in the areas of organization development and executive leadership. More recently, she has worked as an organization development and strategic planning advisor with diverse experience in the financial and education sectors, obtained through over 25 years of academic and professional experience working at the operational and management levels. Dr. Soomer has a sound understanding of contemporary development issues and the impact of these issues on human and social capital development. Her focus has been on the regional integration movement with specific emphasis on the OECS region. A prolific writer, Dr. Soomer has received numerous awards, including the Elsa Govaya Award for History from the University of the West Indies. Dr. Soomer spends her free time mentoring young people and analyzing the game of cricket and its impact on regional integration. She currently serves as St. Lucia's ambassador to CARICOM and the OECS and has responsibility for diaspora issues. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Her Excellency, Dr. June Soomer.
I would like to first start by thanking the Open Campus and Dr. Ghani for affording me this opportunity to deliver the Magna Carta lecture in St. Lucia. You notice that since I became a full-fledged historian in 1994, but gave up that profession 2 years later in 1996 to become a central banker. So it has given me the opportunity to reintroduce myself to my first career. In my life, I've had 3 and 4. So that was my first career as a teacher, and also to indulge in the investigative rigor that is necessary for producing such a paper. I've divided the paper into 3 sections. In the introduction, I examined the 2012 Magna Carta and the rights granted in the Charter. This section also examines the granting of rights on a continuum, citing the 1689 English Bill of Rights and the American Declaration of Independence. And the main aim of this introductory section is to show that Englishmen in England and Englishmen in the colonies focused on the establishment and enactment of laws and constitutions that would eventually increase the rights of the common man. Rights which would be espoused in the American Declaration of Independence as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In the second section of the paper, and it's a long paper, so you'll bear with me because I was just happy to do it, that I went all out. In the second section, the paper examines the designation of Africans as chattel and the removal of their human rights for 3.5 centuries of their enslavement. Some time is spent on the inhumanity of the system of slavery and colonialism, not because I want to reacquaint you with the brutality of the system. Rather, it is an attempt to remind you that the violence of the system never dulled the fight for human rights and a redefinition as a person. I would like to tell the Reparations Committee of St. Lucia that the fight for that redefinition is still very much alive, and that as stated in the Magna Carta and its various upgrades, that even the king is not above the law. In the final section, I will focus on the rights of labor in the post-slavery, post-independence periods. It will show that the struggle against exploitation remained real in the 20th century. And as noted by Nigel Boland in The Politics of Labor in the British West Indies, the burdens of history weigh heavily on Caribbean peoples, as the social and cultural legacies of colonialism and slavery continue to shape their societies and the ways they think about themselves. And so I go to the Magna Carta Libertatum, or the Great Charter of Freedoms, which has been credited with setting the precedents for the English legal system and for promoting and supporting democratic systems of governments in Britain, and is still heralded as a foundation document for freedom and democracy throughout the world today. The document was created about 800 years ago to resolve a dispute between King John and the barons at Runnymede in southern England in 2012. I know all of you know the story of Robin Hood. And that is the story of the Magna Carta, except that Robin Hood is a myth. And those of us who have all these years spent watching Robin Hood and his problems with King John, I would like to tell you now that that is really not the truth, but it has some elements in it because of the fact that King John is the one that the barons at Runnymede, according to Prime Minister Ralph Gonsalves, put over the barrel for him to sign this document. Magna Carta required that King John of England proclaim certain rights, respect certain legal procedures, and accept that his will could be bound by law, something that didn't happen before. So the king was bound by law in this document. It explicitly protected certain rights of the king's subjects, whether free or fettered, because we're talking about the feudal system at this time. Most notably, the writ of habeas corpus, allowing appeal against unlawful imprisonment. Now, that's as much as I will say about the law, really and truly, because I'm a historian, and Dr. Ghani has had all of the lawyers doing this section of his lecture series. But most importantly, it established that the king was not above the law. Although this charter was reissued 3 times in the reign of Henry III, it was incorporated into English law in 1297 by Edward I. You see how long ago that was? 1297, it became law in England. And I'll be doing in my second section the parallels between what's happening in England and what's happening in the Caribbean at the time. Many clauses were renewed throughout the Middle Ages and continued to be renewed as late as the 18th century. By the second half of the 19th century, however, most clauses in their original form had been repealed from English law. Nevertheless, the Magna Carta was the product of its times, very different from our own, yet it continues to be cited by jurists and human rights activists around the globe. Of significance was a minor wording change, the replacement of the term any baron with any freeman, in stipulating to whom the provisions applied. Over time, it would help justify the application of the Charter's provisions to a greater part of the population. While Magna Carta would one day become a basic document of the British Constitution, democracy, and universal protection of ancient liberties, of democracy, the universal protection of ancient liberties were not among the barons' goals. In other words, the Magna Carta, as Dr. Simon said, was not originally written for the common man. The Charter was a feudal document and meant to protect the rights and property of the very few powerful families that topped the rigid feudal system. In fact, the majority of the population, the thousands of unfree laborers, are only mentioned once in a clause concerning the use of court-set fines to punish minor offenses. While the freemen were a minority in the 13th century, the use of the term would eventually include all Englishmen, just as we the people would come to apply to all Americans in the 20th century. Perhaps a good starting point would be an identification of the rights granted under the Magna Carta. The following are the broad rights, but are certainly not exclusive, as the Great Charter was changed at least on three different occasions to suit new political thinking. For the purpose of this exposition, I will start with version 1 and leave the upgrades to another discourse. The barons had grown tired of state interference in religion and enshrined the rights of each individual to enjoy religious freedom. Other rights included the rights of all free citizens to own and inherit property and to be protected from excessive taxes. We would like some of these rights right now. It established the right of widows to own property. It tells you something about how people felt about women in 1215, who own property to choose not to remarry, a right that we deserve, and established principles of due process and equality before the law. It also contained provisions forbidding bribery and official misconduct. More importantly, the rights alluded to in the Magna Carta would find resonance in the 1689 Bill of Rights, which lays down limits on the power of the Crown and sets out the rights of Parliament, including the requirement for regular parliaments, free elections, and freedom of speech in Parliament. We certainly have that in St. Lucia as yesterday, as you could see from what happened yesterday. It set out certain rights of individuals, including the prohibition of cruel and unusual punishment, and re-established the liberty of Protestants to have arms for their defense within the rule of law. It is important to note that the English Bill of Rights, 1689, the American Declaration of Independence, 1776, and the US Constitution, 1789, were all being professed at a time when enslavement took away the fundamental rights of Africans as humans. It can be concluded, therefore, that Englishmen in England and in the colonies did not view natural and historic rights as an entitlement of Africans. Interestingly, the relevance of the Magna Carta finds validation within the cases fought for the anti-slavery movement in both Britain and the United States. In Justin Buckley Dyer's Slavery and the Magna Carta in the Development of Anglo-American Constitutionalism, he notes that in an early abolitionist tract, Granville Sharp, that all of you all know now, argued in his vein that slavery was a gross infringement of the common and natural rights of mankind, and was plainly contrary to the laws and constitution of this kingdom, meaning England. Sharp's invocation of the English Constitution as a bulwark against slavery rested primarily on the principles of the Magna Carta. However, such victories on behalf of the enslaved were few and far between. Another case highlighted by Dyer was that of Dred Scott. After traveling with his master to the Free State of Illinois and the Free Territories north of Missouri, the slave Dred Scott sued for his own freedom, alleging that his residence in free jurisdictions effectively manumitted him from his former state of servitude. While examining the preliminary question of whether Scott was eligible to file suit in federal court, Taney asserts in words that have become familiar that at the time of the American founding, members of that unfortunate race had for more than a century before regarded as beings of an inferior order, and although unfit to associate with the white race, either in social or political relations, and so far inferior that they had no rights, while the white man was bound to respect, and that the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit. In other words, slavery was there to ensure that Africans understood their place and that slavery actually was for their benefit. The judge went on to assert that a slave could not be a citizen under the Constitution of the United States, and further, the rights of the owner over his property were secured in the Constitution. While the Magna Carta may have been used by anti-slavery movements, it was equally used by those in favor of enslavement to enforce the brutal system. Since Africans were not considered human, it was therefore not inconceivable that while in 1776 the American Declaration of Independence would prefer the words that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. While the Constitution, which quickly followed in 1787, would declare an enslaved black person 3/5 of a white person. Under those circumstances, the rights of the common man written into the Magna Carta and espoused in the Declaration of Independence were made inapplicable to the African and his descendants. I'm moving to the second section of the paper, which is looking at slave resistance and the demand for rights. And I move to the other anti-slavery movement conducted by the enslaved from Africa through the Middle Passage and on the plantations in the Caribbean and America, ensuring the undermining of the system. The challenge was not simply a challenge to the notion that one man could enslave another. It was a call for equality and removal of an oppressive and violent system. Aimé Césaire notes that the colonizer, in order to ease his conscience, gets into the habit of seeing the other man as an animal, accustoms himself to treating him as an animal, and tends objectively to transform him into an animal. The 18th century historians Edward Long and Brian Edwards, who wrote on the plantation and slavery system, provide insights into the colonial political order. Long stressed that the colonists, as free men, were entitled to the self-governing institutions in defense of their rights and privileges against the exercise of arbitrary power of the crown. One of the things that happened at the same time as slavery was the fight for rights by white colonists against the crown. They spent a lot of time looking at their own constitutions to ensure that they had rights in the colonies and that these rights were not infringed upon by the crown, something that is very present in the Magna Carta. However, at the same time, they're running a very brutal and violent system. However, the crown itself never saw the assembly, which was the planters' system of government in the colonies, as having the privileges and rights of the members of House of Commons. So there was still discrimination. White men in England were considered the real white men, but those in the colonies had challenges with regard to getting some kind of political control. And when we come down to the third section of the paper, you will notice that eventually that these white men will give up that political control back to the crown when we reinstitute crown colony government, and will, because of that action, will ensure that the movement towards independence for Caribbean countries was a very slow and gradual one, still leaving a lot of the power to the crown. And so at the end, I question our own constitutions and whether they give rights to us, considering that they are based on a lot of these historical imperatives. One of the things that the British did was to ensure that, according to Dennis Benn, that common law of England and statutes passed before the establishment of a colony were in force in the colony, but statutes passed after the establishment of a colony did not extend to it unless the colony was specifically mentioned. This meant that the important statutes that I mentioned, like the Bill of Rights in 1689, and the Act of Settlement, 1701, which granted fundamental rights and freedoms to the subjects, and which also imposed a number of limitations on the royal prerogative, Clearly, the Crown was not ready to give the rights of white Englishmen in England to white colonists in the Caribbean. Therefore, rights for the enslaved population was never in question. Resistance, conflict, and the fight for rights was pervasive under the Caribbean colonial state system. The demand for freedom during the 350 years of enslavement, the post-emancipation period, the labor upheavals of the 1930s and the independence movements were all aimed at not simply the removal of colonial control, but were essentially directed at gaining rights in all spheres. The primary right demanded was the right to freedom. This was entangled with the basic rights to be defined as a human being. The racist ideology which defined Africans as chattel would be the basis of the denial of all human rights. You all understand what chattel means? Let me give you an example, very simple one. When you look at the slave logs and you see the property owned by the planters, you would see things like 2 pigs, 2 cows, 2 Negroes, 2 sheds, etc. So you understand what I'm talking about, what chattel really meant, that you were property. And as property, you did not have the rights, and certainly not the rights that the upgraded Magna Carta would entail. It has been at the root of the black oppression and has evolved into the acceptance by the oppressed themselves of the notion of black inferiority and by extension, the perception that they are not entitled. And if you want me to tell you or give you an example of black inferiority, you can go back to the slavery system where there is an extensive grading of color within the system, where you move from being white to being 3/4 white to being a half white and so on and so forth and so on, to the point where you never, until you get down to being African, that you are, you're defined as not a person. One of the things I've resisted a lot in my life is the kind of identity that refers to you as half of anything. Because my mother was Indian, people tend to refer to me as half an Indian, half Indian. And you realize that these definitions, we don't even think about them, and we don't realize that it is part of our own questioning of ourselves as a people and our own concept of what is better. So it's better for me to be half an Indian for me to be an African. You understand? And I hope that this lecture will make you think about some of these things, especially when you think of your rights as a person. Rights were conferred in the slavery system according to economic status and skin color. It is therefore not surprising that there was an elaborate color grading, as I said, and this system has perpetuated itself in the post-slavery, post-independence period, and it is amazing that skin color is as relevant today as it was during slavery. I remember reading an article maybe sometime last year, I think it was in one of the Barbadian newspapers, where the current prime minister, who is dark-skinned, was not considered to be a very good-looking man because of the color of his skin. And I thought to myself, in this day and age, we still think of these things when we choose, our leaders and the people who we respect. Gordon Lewis, in his reflections in the, never mind that my prime minister is of a certain color. Okay, I'm not looking to lose my job. I'm just saying that that is how we perceive things. Gordon Lewis, in his reflections in the pro-slavery ideology, notes that justification for enslavement of Africans were based on saving their pagan soul. It is, however, in the condemnation of the system that we get a glimpse of the true inhumanity of the system. In 1627, Trey Olanzo, in his writings, likened slavery as being in exile, but also subjugation and hunger, gloom, nakedness, outrage, imprisonment, perpetual persecution, and is finally a combination of all of these evils. All of these depravities would be written into the slave laws, surprisingly. According to Elsa Gavaya, law is not the original basis of slavery in the West Indies colonies, though slave laws were essential for the continued existence of slavery as an institution. Slave laws reveal that all slave systems depended on force for their maintenance. Gavaya adds that in the British slave colonies, the power of the master over his property, the slave, was virtually unlimited, even in some cases as to life and limb. Perhaps the most brutal manifestation of the denial of rights was the average lifespan of the enslaved male, which was estimated as 23 years in the mid-19th century. The long working hours, the poor treatment of the enslaved, the physical violence, and the lack of medical treatment meant that the mortality rate of the African slave on the plantations was extremely high. It was as if they did not have the right to life. Perhaps this poem by a slave can best express the conditions. With 20 hours of unremitting toil, inclined in the fields, and 8 hours to boil or grind the cane. Believe me, few grow old, but life is cheap, and sugar, sir, it's gold. This was after they had survived the Middle Passage. Eric Williams notes that the mortality in the Middle Passage was regarded merely as an unfortunate trading loss. It is therefore not surprising that, with the exception of Barbados in the British colonies, slave populations did not reproduce themselves naturally. According to Thompson, it was only in the post-slavery period in the Caribbean when the black population began to reproduce itself for the first time. He adds that in light of the high mortality rate, the suppressed reproduction, and the replenishing of the populations with more enslaved persons, and replenishing of the population with more enslaved persons, that slavery was nothing less than a genocidal institution. Europeans had also engaged in slavery long before the decision to use Africans, but had been justified in the 1450s by the redefining of Africans as pagans and unbelievers. 200 years after the signing of the Magna Carta, Africans were declared as chattel or property and their humanity removed by a racist ideology that would deny them rights. Although some writers dispute the numbers, believing that it was larger, there is general acceptance that over the 3.5 centuries, approximately 10 to 15 million, hear that? 10 to 15 million Africans were transported to the Americas during the Atlantic slave trade. Rights were denied to them from their capture in Africa. You already know of the brutality of the slave couples on the trip from the interior to the coast. You know about the violence of the barracoons on the coast and the trauma of the Middle Passage. Alvin Thompson writes that the degradation of Africans from human beings to animals and chattel was carried a step further at the sale. They were commonly stripped stark naked, regardless of sex, and examined in the most minute details, even to their genitals. One eyewitness commented that they are examined more intimately than he had observed in any cattle market in Europe. The systematic removal of rights commenced with the ideology of enslavement. Thompson states that New World slavery was a condition where people were considered as the property of others, sometimes in absolute terms. He continues that in few instances were such rights ever restored. This was left either to the individual planter or to the authoritarian state. Under such circumstances, planters got away with mass murder and burying the enslaved alive. Small wonder that some writers have dubbed Caribbean plantations as the killing fields. I move now to that section is a little stressful for me to read and to even say to you. And so you understand why one of the things as a member of the Reparations Committee we call for is some kind of atonement, some kind of healing for our people. So I move now to the post-slavery, post-independence period, and to say to you that there was no level playing field during the post-emancipation decades. What obtained during slavery, obtained after slavery. Policymakers and legislators held a one-dimensional view of the masses as units of labor. The colonial office's opinion had to be taken into account, but the balance of power in each colony favored the planters and other elite groups. Conditions for freedom did not improve as the inequalities and hierarchies of slavery remained intact. In many ways, freedom was an aberration as laborers were forced to remain on plantations. Wages were menial, social and economic conditions continued to decline, more restrictions were placed on freedom of movement, taxes were imposed, and the Prisons Act of 1838 ensured that the oppression would continue. One of the things that, when I was writing my PhD thesis, that I realized is that once you had emancipation, there was a move towards the building of prisons. It's the same thing that we do now. Instead of putting in the social, the amelioration, etc., into the society, the first thing that you do is to build a prison. And we have not stopped with building prisons. Anthony Phillips writes in Emancipation Betrayed, social control legislation in the British Caribbean, that in pursuit of social control of labor, the decision makers devised a series of interlocking tactics. In the first place, control of labor was to be attempted by fixing, people actually sat down and wrote this thing, you know. So they're going to control labor after emancipation, first of all, by ensuring that they cannot leave the plantations. So there are lots of vagrancy and other kinds of laws passed. Secondly, that they would control the wages that were paid. So there was no way you could leave anyway to go and rent or to go and get land for you to work on, etc. Thirdly, they would where labor had the advantage, where there was more labor, where there was little labor, and so wages would be higher, they decided that they would bring in indentured workers to ensure that there was more control over the labor. And even more atrocious is the fact that ex-slaves were expected to pay taxes to supplement the immigration of labor. The numerous grievances over wages, conditions of work, and the amount of work would soon result in a series of labor protests throughout the region. You notice that we never stop fighting for our rights. In St. Lucia, riots triggered by the flogging of a 14-year-old occurred in 1844. The imposition of land taxes on small landowners in 1849 caused even more protests in that island. From the Bahamas to British Guyana, protests over the living and working conditions were pervasive. At the same time, throughout the region, more penal institutions were built, and as infringement of labor laws became criminal offenses, prisons became packed with persons doing 3 months hard labor. Boland writes that a series of Masters and Servants Acts were passed in the British Caribbean, the chief purpose of which was to control and discipline workers. Phillips adds that laws were passed in the following areas of concern and were all designed at control of labor in the post-emancipation period. The franchise. So that was a major concern, so you were not granted, even if you were free, you were not granted the right to vote. The right to vote remained based on your ownership of property and the color of your skin. The militia, of course, you had to control, and this would later turn into policing acts. You had to control the labor. You know, one of the things that struck me, and just as an aside, when I was looking at Haiti during the post-earthquake period, was that the first thing, or the first set of people that were sent to ensure things were all right in Haiti were soldiers and policemen. We still needed to be policed after an earthquake. They were also concerned with licenses to hawkers and other groups, masters and servants legislation, the poor law, and the poor law would eventually morph into to different types of development and welfare issues, vagrancy legislation. So even if you were free, you were not really free to move. Many people were supposed to, or else you would be captured and sent to jail, etc. Squatting on public lands, private lands, prisons, and the stipendiary magistrates and how they would control things. Moreover, in colonies such as Barbados and the Leeward Islands, legislation was resorted to in order to discourage the immigration of able-bodied laborers to Trinidad and British Guyana, which had the dual attractions of high wages and freehold land. So quite apart from the fact that you were restricted internally, you were also restricted from traveling overseas to seek a better life for yourself and your families. And so you understand why we still have these freedom of movement issues within the regional integration movement. It's something that started a long time ago. These heightened tensions in the region would erupt in the 1865 Morant Bay Rebellion in Jamaica, which would change the political and constitutional landscape of the region. The retribution for this rebellion was swift, merciless, and overwhelming. Over 500 persons were killed and 600 flogged publicly. Martial law was declared, and the British decided that the planters could not control the colony, and Crown Colony government was instituted in 1866. This would essentially put government entirely beyond the reach of the black majority. This disenfranchisement would last until adult suffrage was granted in the 1950s. So we had to wait almost another 100 years again before we had the right to vote. And we don't take our right to vote seriously. You see how much we had to struggle to get it? I'm saying that mainly for the young people who are starting to vote. The old representative system would be threatened by the legal emancipation of the enslaved in 1833, but would come to an end in 1865. It would be replaced by the Crown Colony system, which ensured that the colonial government would finally become subordinate to the imperial government. The Morant Bay Rebellion had exposed some of the weaknesses of the colonial government. In the end, the gradualist approach, and I want you to always remember that, the gradualist approach, because things were given to us piecemeal, a little bit at a time, because we supposedly could not, because of our lack of education, deal with all of these complex things, especially things called constitutions. The gradualist approach proposed by Edwards in the 18th century would permeate political and constitutional reform in the Caribbean through the 19th century and would inform the independence movements of the mid-1950s. Nigel Boland writes that one of the most characteristic features of the history of Caribbean societies is the prolonged and pervasive nature of colonialism and labor coercion. Associated with the extreme social inequalities and injustices in an extraordinary degree of authoritarianism, in personal as well as in labor and political relations. It is therefore not surprising that the struggle for rights, justice, and freedom in the 20th century are against those structures of domination that were established in the post-slavery period. I don't have much more to go again, so you can start breathing. The socio-historical context may have changed in the post-slavery period, but there is one constant that prevents the acquisition of rights by the African populations. That is, the inherent racism which is entrenched in the economic power of the white population. The main element of racial accommodation was the cooptation of brown politicians into the political arena throughout the region. And if you look at the early independence movement, our politicians were of that middle class, brown hue. Consequently, while limited political power may have been conferred with independence, the social order was maintained. The long period of colonialism and the short period since independence has not allowed us to transform our political, economic, and social systems to our best advantage. Some territories are indeed still wearing the death shrouds of colonialism. Constitutional reform in the British West Indies was not concerned with conferring rights on the majority of the population or the common man. If the British government seemed unwilling to give more autonomy to planter governments, it was even less inclined to give some political control to the black majority. Instead, the independence movements and the calls for social change and equality were compromised for systems which served to reinforce the values and beliefs of those who designed these constitutions. In the early 18th century, in keeping with the British policy of gradualism, a few concessions were granted to the propertied class, who were then entrusted with the task of ensuring that the representatives of the workers did not succeed in their bid for constitutional advancement based on universal adult suffrage. The calls for wider representation and greater political autonomy to the region was revitalized after the labor riots in the 1930s. The Moyne Commission of 1938, confronted with demands for self-government and universal adult suffrage, proposed that efforts should be made to have all important sections of the population represented on the executive councils, that an advisory committee system should be set up to give elected representatives a chance to gain insights into the workings of government. This was to be the forerunner for the establishment of the ministerial system of government by the mid-1950s, and that government should make efforts towards adult suffrage. So even after all of these riots, all of these protests in the 1930s, you can see the piecemeal approach to giving us some kind of control. The nationalist movement which emerged in the Caribbean was confronted with a dilemma which stems from their traditional ties to the colonial power, which leaders did not want to sever despite desire for independence. So if you look at the literature, you'll see that many of our leaders accepted that they would go for this thing piecemeal. So we would go through internal self-government and a number of different constitutional arrangements that would keep us forever tied to the British Constitution. The West Indies has been under British rule for so long and exposed to Britain's cultural penetration to such an extent that even such militant early nationalists as Cipriani frequently coupled their demands for political reform with sincere expressions of loyalty to the crown. At the same time, the British government made it clear that they had no faith in the ability of these colonies to govern themselves. Unfortunately, the gradualist approach of the British government only reinforced the inequalities in post-independence Caribbean societies. The political leaders were so enthralled with the symbols of independence that the decolonization that was necessary to ensure that the rights of the majority of the population were secured was not done even after independence. I'm saying some tough things, but I think it's things we need to discuss. In conclusion, Magna Carta has been hailed as the foundation of global democracy, and human rights activists consider its principles as underpinning the rights of the common man. The original document has been upgraded to ensure rights of people in imperialist countries. Unfortunately, for centuries, these principles were not applied to millions of people in the world. Perhaps 800 years after its signing, the time has come for another version to be developed to fix the bugs that has limited its relevance. Perhaps the time is now to remove the label of chattel that has destroyed the humanity of millions. Perhaps it is time to recognize that the continued denial of rights of the descendants of enslaved Africans is entrenched in a never-ending racist ideology that has been perpetuated by the same persons who promulgated democracy. Perhaps it is time for our leaders to recognize that the adoption of colonial constitutions has prevented the decolonizations of our countries and would have raised our people out of the doldrums of an inferiority that continues to make us second-class citizens even in our own countries. Perhaps it is time for our leaders to openly support the calls for former colonial governments to accept their culpability in the centuries of persistent and pervasive psychological, social, economic, and political terrorism. Perhaps.
Yes, you have a question here.
Thank you very much, Dr. Suma, for your overview of the Magna Carta and its relevance in the modern day. I had a class to explain rule of law for my A-level students, and I think it's helped a lot. But my question requires your ambassadorial hat more than your academic hat, and that is, what has CARICOM been doing about the plight of Black Haitian parentage citizens in the Dominican Republic?
If you have looked at the various communiques issued by the heads of government, they point to the fact that CARICOM is not in favor of the disenfranchisement of the Haitians. Well, they're not Haitians. They're actually Africans, you know, Haitian Africans who live in the Dominican Republic. And I have been to the Dominican Republic a few times, and the racism strikes you when you get there. You can feel it because people are treated differently, you know. And it reminds me of a story that one of the ministers told me about traveling with the Prime Minister. And when the Prime Minister came in, he being a senior minister was with the Prime Minister, but his skin is much darker than the Prime Minister's. And he said that the person said to him, oh, the security people go this way and the Prime Ministers go this way. You know, and so the heads of government are very, very aware of this. Right now, they're leaving it up to the Haitians to negotiate, because there's an active negotiation going on right now. But one of the things that they have done is to issue a statement saying that the relations with the Dominican Republic, because the Dominican Republic has been interested in becoming part of the whole Caribbean community, that will be on hold until this is resolved. So it is something that the heads are taking very seriously. We recognize our debt to Haiti. It's not something that we ever speak about. And these are conversations that we should be having in this country. We recognize our debt to Haiti. We don't understand our debt to Haiti. And so, but I think at the level of the community, there's this kind of push towards ensuring that Haiti is treated fairly.
Anyway, the question for you is that you didn't mention much about the situation of the vassals and the serfs in Europe, which I think blends with our situation with our slaves here, because the serfdom was abolished in Europe pretty much the same time or even later than the abolition of slavery in the Caribbean. Thank you.
Because while what you say is true, that there's this omission, I also omitted the group called the Poor Whites in the Caribbean. I tried to concentrate on what was happening to a specific set of people. I mean, the over 15 million people that, over 300 years were enslaved. To a certain extent, the serfs experienced extreme conditions also, but that was, in my opinion, to a large extent, a class issue and not a race issue. I mean, I think one of the fundamental things that I hope that I got across, that this was an issue about race. That you were denied rights because of your race, not because of your class. The class issue would become more relevant in the post-independence period, but to a large extent, there was this institution in Europe that, especially in England, for example, the English don't like the Irish. And so Irish people were treated differently even if they were white. So you have this class and nationalist issues throughout Europe that will cause a lot of problems. You can see them even now as you look at the fights that are happening in Europe. A lot of the, But I was trying to concentrate, and hopefully somebody else who will be looking at the Magna Carta in its pure sense in Europe will add that dimension to your paper, the whole discourse on the Magna Carta.
I was responsible for organizing this lecture during the day. I want to say thank you to them, because most lectures are held at nights, and some of the population are disadvantaged to attend. One, the students that are all here today, at night, they're doing their homework at home, or their parents would not allow them out at night, so they are not able to attend some of these lectures. And if we are relying on the younger generation to bring about change, they have to be included. And people of a certain age cannot come to Sir Arthur Lewis at 10 o'clock at night or whatever it is to attend things like this. So I really want to commend whoever organized this lecture in the middle of the day, so students and people who are over a certain age are free to attend at Sir Arthur Lewis. So this is, for this, I say thank you to the individual. And the other thing I thought maybe I would have heard at the lecture is the role of churches or religion or something doing whatever it is the British or the French were doing to the slaves. The role of churches or religion in making sure that that oppression is continued in the vicious way it was happening, and coming here to save our souls. And our bodies don't matter, our souls matter, just to reinforce all the trickery and whatever it is the British, the French, and whoever it is was imposing on us. So anyway, I am glad. My generation may not be able to do too much about it. Maybe these can. Thank you.
I did not go into churches in particular, but the church and the state work together to ensure the oppression. It was a very in-depth lecture, and so some things had to suffer. But I did mention the issue of saving the pagan soul. In fact, that was the justification from the Spanish, from the beginning, that because after they had decimated the indigenous populations in the Caribbean, people like Las Casas, etc., asked for Africans to be brought in as laborers. Okay, and you will find that the Dutch church is the one, to a large extent, because the Dutch are the first real slave traders. They're the first to really get into it and the last to get out of it. The church defined people as pagan. But even long before that, remember we were talking about King John? King John had a brother named Richard. And he used to go on crusades also to do this thing, to civilize and to bring people to, you know, a certain understanding, remove them from their pagan ways. And so it happened, it started a long time ago. The difference, and there was slavery also at that time, same as they were serfs in Europe. The main difference, and in Diary of a Slave, you can see it. The main difference between European slavery and serfdom, etc., and what happened with Africans in the Caribbean was the economic factor. You would the fact that you would first of all defined as property, and second, the fact that your labor was what was used to develop Europe to a large extent, something that they have never accepted, but something that we can prove time and time again. All of that was tied in with the whole Christian value. And so the church is very involved. And perhaps you can also see it when you look at the slave laws, because the church is even mentioned in the slave laws. So it is important to note that all of the institutions, including the church, the political system, the constitutional systems, the church systems, all the systems were involved in ensuring that racist ideology was perpetuated. Good day.
My question might stray a little away from the topic, but I hope you can answer me effectively. It mentions in the piece of paper here that you're an ambassador to CARICOM on behalf of St. Lucia. And I believe that when each Caribbean country decide to branch out on their own to get a little sense of independence, the major countries take advantage of that. Do you believe if all the Caribbean countries came together, it would make a huge difference in what we see and do in the world on a whole?
One of the things that perhaps we can have a little lecture on is the issue of regional integration, and because it has its roots in history, and I actually wrote my PhD thesis on regional integration, starting from the beginning. Caribbean governments perhaps have not done a very good job at showing and marketing, maybe they need RSL to help them, marketing the things that they have done together. We hear about a lot of the missteps, but we don't hear a lot about the successes. And one of our biggest successes is in coming together to face the world. Okay? The fact that at the level of the United Nations or at the level of Europe, we speak with one voice is extremely important. We have 14 votes in the UN, and one of the reasons why we are courted so much by other governments is because they realize the power of the 14 votes. I mean, I'd like to put on record my personal view that we have not used our 14 votes effectively enough, but it is one of the things that we do. At the level of the OSS, for example, we have joint missions. At the level of CARICOM, we are in the process of doing that also. So they realize that coming together against the outside is very important. Never mind that sometimes, because we are so close to each other, we would step on each other's toes. But in dealing with the outside world, we speak with one voice.
That was fascinating and interesting and very, very clear, but unfortunately it left out the majority of the people in this room. You said about it being a racist issue, but I was hearing women, because women were chattels. Women were not allowed to hold property. Not just black women, white women as well. Perhaps the widows were allowed to inherit under Magna Carta. Perhaps they were allowed to choose not to marry. But I don't know how many of the rest of you noticed that and the rather veiled suggestion later that the slaves were stripped and examined and their genitals were examined towards the end of the lecture. That's the only place where the women got in. So it was a world of men again. And one of these days, come and ask me, I don't want to be too long, but there's a lady from down the Mabuya Valley. She died in 1834. Her name was Petronille, and she would stand up beside any of these men who were fighting for freedom for black people in St. Lucia. But you can ask me afterwards. So please, women.
I deliberately left it out. I have a whole set of research on women and slave resistance, that I would love to share with you. And but just to say here, because Mrs. Williams asked that question, I can add a few things. That women were exploited both for their production and their reproduction during slavery. I mean, I didn't want to get into that. I was already emotional about the other part, about the violence and the rights. So if I had to get into the issue of women again, it would be, a really emotional one for me. But we were exploited for both our production and our reproduction. We worked as hard as men in the fields. There was no distinction between working hours for men and women. You were expected to do the same thing at the same time that you were expected to give birth. And so you wonder why there was no reproducing of ourselves during the period of enslavement. Okay? Apart from that, we were discriminated against not only because of the color of our skin, but because we were women. So you have different levels of discrimination within the system because you are a woman. Okay? So invite me back and I'll tell you more.
In terms of the church and its role, as Eric Williams has sort of written quite a bit about the role of the church, what it gave if the right hand, it took back if the left hand in terms of slavery and enslavement and so forth. It is also important to note that the church has played a very important part in the dismantling of the slave trade and apartheid. It's always a theology like in apartheid. It began with a theology, but it's also the children of apartheid and the children of the system that fights. So the struggle begins sometimes from both within and without.
Yes.
Very, very important for students to know that. But I want to look at the extent of the arms of the Magna Carta in the mainland Africa itself, and to bring it to modern day struggles that exist in terms of squatters' rights and land rights in places like Zimbabwe and South Africa. And we sometimes, because we are products of that whole system, that post-colonial and post-emancipation system, we blame the victims to some extent, rather than analyzing the things sufficiently. And case in point, and that is why I want you to speak to that, to expound a little on that. We have President Mugabe in Southern Africa, and we demonize him in toto. And I understand the atrocities there that he's committed against his own people and all of that. But my point is, How do we separate the evils that he's done? And we should point out the evils, and to look at the whole idea of reclaiming the land to its rightful owners that were taken, ripped from the if I want to use the term, unjustly taken away from them, their rightful land, and to return it to them. And he's demonized in the press. He's treated as though he's such an evil being. How do we kind of find that reflective equilibrium? I thank you.
Things that came to mind when you started to speak was the fact that we have been talking about decolonization, but to a large extent, many countries still live under colonialism, even if they are independent, because we did not change anything. All we did was to adopt a constitution. Things will not change. But there is a deeper question with regard to racism and ideology. I would like to move you a little away from a specific figure in terms of Mugabe, and to bring you to a bigger picture, where something that I have noticed in the last maybe 5 years, the recolonization of Africa. And if we do not at this point understand that Africa belongs to Africans, that recolonization of Africa will aggravate situations like, because Mugabe is how old? Almost 90? 90. He will not be for as much longer. Maybe another 10 years. Okay? But struggles like that for the right of Africans to own Africa will become more intense because of the fact that you have the discovery of new forms of wealth in Africa. Remember that the wealth at the time of enslavement were the people. Labor was the wealth. And I don't have to go into the whole discourse that Walter Rodney went into about how Europe underdeveloped Africa. But African leaders at this point don't realize that decolonization is important before recolonization takes place. We will have these struggles continuing. You cannot tell me that countries that have so much wealth, look at Nigeria, look at the oil and so on in Nigeria, have such massive, massive poverty. And you cannot tell me that in a year where we're celebrating the 800th anniversary of the Magna Carta, that the world will leave Africans to die, I mean, under genocidal regimes, under extreme poverty, under extreme exploitation, under extreme disease, etc. I don't believe in conspiracy theories, but that's all I'm saying. But
let me say very quickly that we mentioned the race issue that emerged after emancipation. Interestingly enough, it is still with us, but now politicians are being blamed for being too white.
Yes.
And the word is blame.
Yes.
For being too white, accused of various things because they are too white, unlike the past where our politicians needed to be white. Let me say that, white or high brown, let me say that I want the young people to know that John Compton is indeed the father of the nation. John Compton, when the colonial powers began to shed us, at first we had associated statehood. And he denounced them in the house of whatever it is, yes. I didn't know, I don't know now. And I remember his words, "You have exploited us." And he went on. In fact, the world was so astounded. BBC interviewed him. I heard him then. He had only radio in those days, not television. He was written about in the Time magazine. And then a politician from the plantation era, from the plantocracy, whom we hadn't heard, I had not heard in my lifetime, I had heard of him. He came back on the platform, Sir Garnet Gordon, and he condemned John Compton for what he had done in England. I just want you to know that at that time, he was considered to be extraordinarily bold to have spoken as he did when we got our first step of being shed. Thank you.
Thank you. Where we accept people, that's just it. Whether you're disabled, whether you are a woman, whether you are a different color, etc. The issue is that you are a citizen and that you are human, and that hopefully the Magna Carta would have included everybody in its next revision. You know, I hope, Dr. Ghani, that it's true that most of the clauses have been repealed and upgraded, etc., etc. But as we change our constitutions, that's why we can do it now within our own constitutional reform in these countries, that we recognize that we are people, we are humans, and you notice that in my lectures, that we are recognized as people. No matter what the color of your skin is, no matter your hair texture, anything else, that we are human.
We've had a very fascinating and thought-provoking lecture and post-lecture question and answer period. So I'd like you to join me in thanking Her Excellency Ambassador Dr. June Soomer for her lecture and her answers to questions.